Chapter 6. Aside from the view, the top of Halcone Rock had little to recommend it. Rocky spikes and spikier clumps of yucca dotted the flat top of the rock formation. To the south, a few faint lights marked Cape Madra, where it dozed beneath the starry sky. He took a moment to savor the cool, late-night desert breeze that swept over him, letting it reinvigorate his tired body. After a few minutes soaking up the tranquility, he was ready to search. "All right, Matthew, let's see what big secret you're hiding up here." He made a circuit of the top of the rock, relying on his keen night vision. No sense breaking out his mag light and possibly drawing attention to himself unless absolutely necessary. He picked his way carefully along the uneven surface, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. His turn around the rock took about 20 minutes, and nothing leaped out at him. He supposed it was possible that it wasn't the top of the rock per se, but the rock in general that Matthew and the deputy were keeping outsiders clear of. After all, the article had said the so-called aliens might have come up from underground. But he had gone to the trouble of climbing up here, so he might as well make a thorough inspection. He took out his mag light and replaced the clear lens with a red one, which would better preserve his night vision and be harder to spot from a distance. Cupping the flashlight to hide the beam, he began working a grid back across the rock. Maddock, his best friend and business partner, would be proud of him. Whenever they searched for a sunken ship, Maddock preferred the orderly, painstaking approach to searches, while Bones would prefer to wing it. In fairness, winging it didn't often work out, but when it did, it saved them a great deal of time and spared Bones a wealth of boredom. The search proved equally fruitless. 10 yards away, a tall stone spire marked the west end of the rock, with nothing but coarse stone to fill the intervening space. "I guess it's back down again. At least I got to do some more climbing." More out of a sense of obligation than purpose, he completed his search. When he reached the spire, he let out a whistle. "What have we got here?" Footprints scuffed the sun-baked patch of dirt at the foot of the spire, and off to the side lay a deep scrape where something heavy had been dragged a short distance. Someone had been busy in this very spot. A manhole-sized slab of rock lay at an angle against the base of the spire. Bones heaved against it and slid it to the side. "Jackpot!" A dark shaft dropped down about 5 feet to a narrow passageway that disappeared into the darkness. By the looks of it, it was just wide enough to accommodate his bulk. "Dark, creepy tunnel heading down into who knows where. This is totally my jam." Hard racing, he slid feet first into the passageway. Once inside, he exchanged his red lens for the standard clear one. Down here, his night vision would be useless, and there was no danger of anyone seeing him, so he might as well have as much light as possible. The way down was steep and irregular, a natural fissure exacerbated over time by the heating and cooling of the rock, and washed clean by occasional rainfalls. He slipped, slid, and clambered deeper into the darkness until he finally came down in a low chamber about 20 feet across. He shone his light all around. A few stalactites dangled from the ceiling, and white cave pearls glinted on the floor. Multiple passageways led off in various directions. He found his way into a cavern system. "Holy crap, I don't have time to explore every freaking one of these." He didn't have to explore at all. A quick inspection revealed that someone, Matthew, he assumed, had marked all but one of the openings with an X in yellow chalk. "I wonder how long it took him to explore and eliminate all these other passageways." Grinning at the thought of benefiting from what likely represented months, if not years, of Matthew's efforts, Bones headed down the unmarked passageway. Like most caverns, the way twisted and turned, rose and fell, but gradually descended. He lost all sense of how far he traveled in this dark, unrelenting stone tube. He kept a sure grip on his maglite, knowing he'd be in trouble if he should lose it. After traveling for a good 15 minutes, bypassing several caves and passages marked with an X, he came to a halt at the edge of a yawning pit. Smooth-sided and 20 feet across, it dropped 50 feet or more to a rock-choked bottom. The passageway continued on the other side. Bones shone his light around, and the beam fell on a pile of lumber, all short lengths of 2x4s, a box of nails, and a hammer. He chuckled. Was Matthew going to try and build a bridge out of 3-foot-long boards? "I'll bet that idiot tried to carry standard-length lumber down here and couldn't make it through the tight curves. Wish I'd been there to see it." Smiling, he played his light around the cavern, wondering how he might make it across. One option was to climb down into the pit and then climb back up the other side, but he'd need gear and a partner for that. Perhaps there was another way. He carefully inspected the chamber and realized that the walls weren't smooth at all. Deep, jagged clefts split the surface, running horizontally from one side of the defile to the other. A spark of an idea kindled his adventurous spirit. His friends called it reckless, but Bones knew his capabilities. "I can do this." His eyes followed the flashlight beam as it dropped to the bottom of the pit far below. "I'd better do this or else I'm screwed." He took a minute to try and talk himself out of this course of action. There was no need, he thought, to investigate any further. What did he care if Matthew was looking for underworld aliens? It wasn't his problem. Why risk falling, maybe to his death, just to beat the man to the other side? But the truth was, this wasn't about besting Matthew. This was about Bones' innate curiosity and his fascination with all things strange and mysterious. It was the sort of legend he and Maddock were always chasing down, and usually doing it in much more perilous circumstances than this. Bones wasn't a fearful man, and he wasn't about to be deterred by a challenging climb. His mind now made up, he took time to plan his route. He wished he had a helmet lamp and helmet to put it on, but his maglite would have to do. His eyes traced the cracks in the rock, picking out handholds and footholds. When he was satisfied he'd chosen the best path, he clamped his flashlight in his teeth, slid his foot into a crevasse, and began to climb. Chapter 7. Bones worked his way across the chasm, his thoughts focused on nothing but the next handhold or foothold. In the deep recesses of his mind, he was aware of the precipitous fall that would result from a single mistake. But if he did what he was supposed to do, it wouldn't matter. All he had to do was remain focused on the task at hand. Adrenaline coursed through him, all his senses alive. What was it about putting himself in mortal peril that excited him so? It was just the way he was wired, and that wasn't going to change. Plenty of people had tried to break him of it, and all had failed. When he stepped onto solid ground again, he took a moment to look back at the way he'd come, making a mental note of the path he'd taken so he could reverse it on the way back. Finally satisfied he had it down, he hurried along the passageway. He rounded a sharp turn and stopped short, 20 paces ahead beyond a floor strewn with debris and set in a wall covered in pictographs. A gleaming metal door barred the way. He saw no hinge or doorframe. It was as if the metal was part of the wall. He took a few steps closer, running his light up and down its length. It was flawless. Not a single scratch or spot of rust marred its surface. "What the hell is this made of?" he muttered. "Titanium?" He moved closer, picking his way through the debris that he now recognized as signs of sacrifice. Shriveled ears of corn, dried flowers twisted into wreaths, fetishes crafted from sticks and yucca fibers, and the bones of small animals. Sometime, most likely in the distant past, the native peoples had known of this place and had apparently sought to appease whoever or whatever lived behind the door. Bones extended a hand to touch the door, but hesitated. Should he touch it? What if it was electrified or something? He reached out and tapped the door with his maglite. Nothing. The door seemed to absorb sound. He repeated the procedure with the blade of his knife. Still nothing. Oh, what the hell. You didn't come all this way to wuss out now. He took a deep breath and pressed his palm to the surface of the door. The icy cold metal grew warm at his touch and then went cold again. That's it. He tried with his other hand. Same result. Disappointed, he banged on the door a few times, then tried pushing it, but to no avail. He looked for a handle, a controller, or even a seam around the edges, but even up close it looked to be a part of the natural rock. He could no longer keep the thoughts of aliens out of his mind. All the stories he'd ever read about extraterrestrials in New Mexico began to scroll through his mind. Could this be proof? It was certainly something, but it wouldn't mean much if he couldn't get to the other side. He took a few steps back and shone his light over the cave walls, inspecting the pictographs. Many were common sights to the southwest, spirals, suns, and animals, but he saw several variations on the same theme, people bowing down to starry-eyed men who were climbing up long staircases. Well, they aren't coming down from the sky, that's for sure. He took out his phone and snapped pictures of the cavern, recording the door and all the surrounding pictographs in as much detail as he could. He gave the door one more try to see if it would budge, but again he felt only the brief flash of warmth, as if the door were trying to recognize him. Finally, he accepted there was nothing more he could do at the moment. He'd go back to the motel, get some sleep, and make a plan on how to further investigate. He could think of worse ways to kill a few days. The climb back over the chasm took a little longer than it had on the way in. No longer buoyed by the thrill of anticipation, he slogged across, trying not to let his thoughts drift to what lay beyond the door. Once he missed a step and let out a curse as he held on tight, his toes searching to rediscover its hold. Just as he found it, he heard a low, muffled sound drifting through the cavern, an echo of his cry. And then he heard it again, the sound of voices. Someone was coming. That's going to be Matthew. Crap. He completed the climb across, hurried over to the pile of building materials where he ducked down to listen. The voices were still indistinct, but coming closer. He could tell there were two different speakers, perhaps Matthew and the deputy. He considered his options. He had as much right to be here as they did, so he could simply walk out and take his chances that they'd leave him unmolested. He discarded that thought as patently absurd. He wasn't wanted here, and if the deputy was armed, what would stop him from shooting Bones and dropping his body into the pit or covering it in rocks and leaving it? No one would ever find him down here, of that he was certain. That left stealth or main force as his avenues for escape. The voices became clearer. He could tell for certain that two men were talking. He could make out a few stray words. Not in his hotel room. No way he found. Somebody move the rocks. They were talking about him. Time for action. He picked up a short length of 2x4 from the pile of building materials, moved off to the side, and turned out his light. Inky darkness enveloped him. The best night vision in the world was no good without at least a sliver of light. Fortunately, he was comfortable in the darkness and in confined spaces. He had spent enough time in both over the years. Soon a faint glow announced the approach of someone carrying a light of some sort. Bones gripped the chunk of wood like a baseball bat and tensed. "The pit's up here." The voice sounded like the deputy, though Bones couldn't be sure. "I don't see anyone. Maybe he's lost in one of the tunnels." A note of hopefulness rang in Matthew's voice. "Probably. I'll take a look in here just to be sure." The deputy was looking back over his shoulder at Matthew when he stepped into the chamber, and Bones took full advantage. He opted against the 2x4 and instead drove the heel of his palm into the man's temple with all his might. The deputy's knees buckled and Bones caught him and eased him to the ground. He hastily dragged the deputy off to the side, removed his boots, stuffed a sock into his mouth, and bound his wrists and ankles with his laces, and then extinguished the man's flashlight and laid it on the stack of lumber. One down. "Hector, you okay in there?" Matthew called a few moments later. "Tripped and hit my head," Bones groaned, trying to add a touch of the deputy's accent to the words. He heard hasty footsteps coming down the passageway. He resumed his position, and when Matthew strode into the chamber, Bones was ready. He cracked Matthew in the back of the head with a 2x4. Matthew cried out and staggered forward a few steps. Bones struck again, baseball style, knocking Matthew's flashlight out of his hand and sending it spinning down into the pit. The light vanished as the flashlight disappeared from sight. "What the hell?" Matthew wailed. Bones backed away from the sound of the man's voice, feeling for the passageway that would lead him out of the cavern. He'd love to stay and give Matthew the kind of beatdown a man who hits women so richly deserved, but decided against it. He'd assaulted a police officer, and a fight with Matthew, however brief, could leave marks on Bones that might identify him. Best to get while the getting was good. He found the open passageway and moved quickly and silently until Matthew's curses faded away and he felt safe turning on his mag light. He made the climb back to the surface as quickly as he could. It felt like an eternity, and when he finally emerged atop Halcone Rock, he fell to his knees, lungs heaving, clothing drenched with sweat. He spared only a few moments to rest before he pushed the slab of rock back over the hole that led into the pit. He wondered how long it would take Matthew to feel around in the dark and find the deputy's flashlight. He hoped the idiot crawled off the edge of the pit by accident. He doubted he could be that lucky, but at least he'd made their lives difficult. Score one for the good guys. Chapter 8. A sharp rap at the door roused Bones from slumber. He rolled over and cracked one eye. The digital display on the cheap motel alarm clock read 8:08. Too early after the night he just had. He closed his eyes and pulled the covers over his head. The knock came again. "I don't need service today," he called. "Sheriff's Department." A low groan of holy crap escaped his lips and he sat up. "Just a minute, I'm not dressed." He figured he didn't need to hurry. There was no back window or other means of escape, so it's not like the cops would be in a hurry to knock down the door and nab him before he slipped away. He pulled on jeans and a t-shirt and smoothed his hair back before opening the door. He'd expected to see Hector, the deputy whom he'd knocked unconscious the night before, but the man who stood there was a solid fellow of late middle years. He was Anglo, his neatly combed brown hair dusted with silver. His reflective sunglasses told Bones just how bad he looked after his late-night exertion and limited sleep. "How can I help you?" "I'm the sheriff." The man didn't provide his name, but his name tag read W. Craig Jameson. Bones didn't need a full night's sleep to put the pieces together. The man was Matthew's father. Great. "Good to meet you." It was a lie, but Bones wasn't holding any cards in this situation, so he opted for courtesy. Sheriff Jameson took off his glasses and tilted his head, inspecting Bones up and down with rheumy blue eyes. "You don't look so good. Have a late night?" Bones forced a laugh. "If there's any nightlife here, nobody told me about it. I'm just a late sleeper. I'm not at my best until lunchtime. Coffee helps, too." Jameson nodded. "Can I come in? I need to ask you a few questions." Bones stepped to the side and allowed the sheriff to come inside. The man took a seat at the small window side table, and Bones took the chair opposite him. "What's your business in Madera?" "I don't have any. My truck broke down, and I'm waiting for Manny to get the parts in to fix it." "Where are you headed?" "Meeting friends in Vegas. I should have been there last night." He grimaced at the thought of Matt and Willis partying without him. He was missing it all. Drinks, casinos, and the girls. "I understand you were out at Alcone Rock yesterday." The sheriff arched an eyebrow. "I went for a run and ended up at a rock formation. I guess that's the name of it." "What were you doing out there?" "Like I said, I went for a run and that's where I ended up." Bones pushed back from the table. "You mind if I make some coffee while we talk? I can make you a cup, too." His thoughts were cloudy, and he didn't want to slip up and say something that could implicate him in what happened last night. "You go ahead, I'm fine." Jameson cleared his throat. "It seems a little strange that you would end up at Alcone Rock, of all places. That's a restricted area." "Not that strange," Bones said, keeping his back to the sheriff while he busied himself with a coffee maker. "It's public land and a nicer place to run than the highway. The rock was the only thing on the horizon, so I ran to it." "That's a long way to run." Bones shrugged. "I didn't have anything better to do." "You had an incident with my deputy while you were there." "If you call him telling me to leave and me complying an incident, then I guess so." Bones hit the button to start the coffee brewing and turned to face the sheriff. "I've got to ask, how can that be a restricted area if it's public land? No offense, but your deputy isn't a fed and neither are you. Is that why you went back last night?" The question came sharp and fast, but Bones had been ready for it. "I haven't been back. Dude told me to leave, so I left." Jameson folded his arms. "Why don't I believe you?" "Probably because working in law enforcement doesn't exactly reinforce your faith in the human race." Bones smiled, but the sheriff didn't return it. "Can anybody verify your whereabouts last night?" "I don't know anybody except Manny." Behind him, the coffee maker began to sputter and spit, and the welcome aroma of brewing coffee filled the air. "You know Mary?" "She gave me a ride when my car broke down. The only thing I really know about her is she's got a boyfriend who hits her." Jameson flinched at that. Bones had drawn first blood. How would the sheriff respond? "I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Bonebrake." "That's always nice." Bones turned and busied himself with a coffee. He normally took it black, but he added cream and sugar just to kill a little time while Jameson stared at his back. "I did some checking on you. For some reason, I could learn almost nothing about you. Why?" "Maybe Google is not your friend?" Bones took a sip of coffee and locked eyes with the sheriff. He had to be careful here. If he followed his normal instincts, he might piss the guy off enough to get himself locked up on some bogus charge. Time to rein it in. "Actually, I'm ex-military, and I've been involved in a lot of sensitive stuff. I can't say for sure, but I think the powers of the be have erased a lot of my history." That was half true. A government agency had, in fact, gone to great lengths to hide much of his history, but that had mostly been done by Tam Broderick, head of the Myrmidon Squad, for reasons of her own. Jameson nodded. "I did learn that you have an interest in aliens." "Aliens, Nessie, Bigfoot, I love all that crap. Have since I was a kid." "So you know the legends surrounding Alcone Rock?" It wasn't a question. When Bones merely shook his head, the sheriff continued. "Some of your UFO-crazy friends have tried to say there were alien encounters there. It's based on an old Indian legend. Since you're both a UFO nut and an Indian, I have trouble believing you've never heard about it." Bones took another sip of coffee to prevent himself from making a sarcastic reply. "First of all, I'm a Cherokee. Suggesting I'm related to the local native population would be like calling you Canadian just because you're white. Second, if I wanted to check out Halcone Rock, I'd do it. I wouldn't sabotage my transmission and cost myself a chunk of change when I'm supposed to be partying in Sin City with my friends." Jameson stared, letting the conversation lapse. It was a common tactic. People had a natural urge to fill silences, and patient silence often proved more effective than asking questions. Bones knew that trick and many more. As a former Navy SEAL, he'd been trained to both utilize and resist much more severe interrogation tactics than this. He stood there drinking his coffee until the sheriff relented. Jameson stood and let out a long, slow breath. "Mr. Bonebrake, I know you went to Halcone Rock last night and you assaulted 2 men, and when I can prove it, I'm going to make your life very unpleasant." Bones merely smiled and waited for the man to see himself out. When the door closed behind Jameson, Bones let out a groan. Why did trouble always seem to find him?